The story of George Stinney Jr. is a searing indictment of racial prejudice and a stark reminder of the fragility of justice in the face of fear and hate. In the spring of 1944, the world outside Alcalá, South Carolina buzzed with news of the Second World War. Yet this small, segregated town found itself consumed by a different kind of tragedy: the murder of two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7. Their deaths, a horrific discovery in a water-filled ditch, sent shockwaves through the community. Fear and grief, potent emotions, quickly morphed into a thirst for swift justice. In this pressure cooker of suspicion and sorrow, authorities turned their attention to 14-year-old George Stinney Jr., a black child who lived with his family near where the girls were last seen. George's arrest marked the beginning of a horrifying miscarriage of justice, a stark testament to the deep-seated racial prejudice that permeated the Jim Crow South. His trial, if one could call it that, lasted a mere 2 hours. The verdict, delivered by an all-white jury after just 10 minutes of deliberation, condemned George to death. He became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. The accusations against George were flimsy at best, built on whispers and conjecture rather than concrete evidence. Witnesses claimed to have seen the girls talking to George and his younger sister earlier that day, a seemingly innocuous interaction that took on sinister implications in the charged atmosphere. There was no physical evidence linking George to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses to the murders themselves. The prosecution's case relied heavily on a coerced confession, allegedly obtained after hours of interrogation without the presence of George's parents or an attorney. The details of the confession itself were suspect, with the alleged murder weapon, a metal spike, never being found. The prosecution's narrative hinged on the assumption that a 14-year-old boy could single-handedly overpower and kill two girls older than himself, then dispose of their bodies without leaving a trace. George's trial was a mockery of justice, a chilling example of how racial bias can poison the legal system. His court-appointed attorney, a local tax commissioner with no prior experience in criminal defense, offered a shockingly inadequate defense. Witnesses, most of whom were white, provided conflicting accounts of the events leading up to the girls' disappearance. Their testimonies, often fueled by fear and prejudice, painted a damning picture of the young black defendant. The courtroom, filled with a palpable tension, became a stage for a predetermined verdict. The jury, composed entirely of white men, deliberated for a mere 10 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. The speed with which they reached their decision spoke volumes about the lack of true deliberation, highlighting the pervasive influence of racial prejudice. George Stinney Jr.'s execution was a horrifying spectacle, a grotesque display of state-sanctioned murder disguised as justice. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, he was led to the electric chair, a small, frail figure dwarfed by the apparatus of death. The electric chair, intended for adults, was ill-fitted for his slight frame. The mask, too large for his face, slipped as the first jolt of electricity surged through his body. Witnesses described a horrific scene, the young boy's convulsing body and muffled cries serving as a grim reminder of the injustice unfolding before their eyes. His death, a tragic footnote in the annals of American history, underscored the systemic racism that pervaded the criminal justice system, particularly in the Jim Crow South. George's story, marked by hasty judgment, inadequate legal representation, and the undeniable stench of racial bias, became a chilling testament to the deadly consequences of prejudice. Section 5. Echoes of Injustice. The Scottsboro Boys, and the Shadow of Prejudice. The tragic case of George Stinney Jr. stands as a chilling reminder of the systemic racism that has plagued the American justice system for centuries. His story echoes other infamous miscarriages of justice, such as the Scottsboro Boys case of the 1930s. 9 young black men were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama. Like George, the Scottsboro Boys faced a legal system rigged against them. They were denied adequate legal representation and subjected to a sham trial fueled by racial prejudice. Although none of the accused were sentenced to death, they endured years of imprisonment and legal battles before their convictions were eventually overturned. These cases, separated by time but united by injustice, highlight the vulnerability of marginalized communities, particularly black children, within a legal system that often prioritizes expediency over fairness and truth. They underscore the urgent need for systemic reform to address the root causes of racial bias and ensure equal justice for all. Section 6. A Glimmer of Hope, the Overturned Conviction. For over 7 decades, George Stinney Jr.'s name remained etched in the annals of history as a tragic symbol of racial injustice. However, the fight for justice, though delayed, was not forgotten. In 2014, 70 years after his wrongful conviction and execution, George Stinney Jr. was finally exonerated. A South Carolina judge reviewing the case overturned George's conviction, citing fundamental violations of due process. The judge acknowledged the lack of evidence, the coerced confession, and the inadequate legal representation that had plagued the original trial. While this posthumous exoneration could not erase the horrific injustice inflicted upon George and his family, it served as a powerful testament to the enduring power of truth and the importance of holding the justice system accountable for its past transgressions. It also ignited a national conversation about racial bias in the justice system and the urgent need for reform. Section 7. Protecting the Innocent, Roper v. Simmons and the Fight for Juvenile Rights. The tragic case of George Stinney Jr. also highlights the vulnerability of children within the criminal justice system. His execution at such a young age sparked outrage and contributed to a growing movement advocating for the abolition of the death penalty for juveniles. In 2005, the Supreme Court, in a landmark ruling in Roper v. Simmons, declared the execution of individuals who were under the age of 18 at the time of their crimes to be unconstitutional. The court recognized the inherent cruelty of subjecting juveniles to the death penalty, citing their diminished culpability and greater potential for rehabilitation. This ruling, a significant victory for juvenile justice advocates, acknowledged the developmental differences between children and adults and the need for a justice system that prioritizes rehabilitation over retribution for young offenders. Section 8. The Enduring Legacy of George Stinney Jr. The story of George Stinney Jr., though deeply tragic, has left an indelible mark on the American conscience. His case serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of justice and the devastating consequences of racial prejudice. It compels us to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past and acknowledge the systemic biases that continue to plague the present. George's legacy lives on in the countless individuals and organizations fighting for a more just and equitable society. His story has inspired legal reforms, fueled social justice movements, and ignited a national conversation about racial bias in the criminal justice system. The fight for justice continues, driven by the memory of George Stinney Jr. and countless others who have been denied their fundamental rights. It is a fight for a future where every child, regardless of race, socioeconomic background, or zip code, is afforded the presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial, and the opportunity to reach their full potential. Section 9. Continuing the fight for justice. We must honor George Stinney Jr.'s memory by continuing to dismantle the systems of oppression that led to his wrongful conviction and execution. This requires a multi-pronged approach, encompassing legal reforms, educational initiatives, and a fundamental shift in societal attitudes. We must advocate for policies that address racial disparities in the justice system, such as implicit bias training for law enforcement and legal professionals, comprehensive indigent defense systems, and sentencing reforms that prioritize rehabilitation over incarceration. Education plays a vital role in combating prejudice and fostering empathy. By teaching future generations about the injustices of the past, such as the case of George Stinney Jr., we can empower them to challenge discrimination and create a more just and equitable future. The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires unwavering commitment, collective action, and a belief in the power of human beings to learn from the mistakes of the past and create a better future for all. Let the tragic story of George Stinney Jr. serve as a constant reminder of the importance of this fight and the urgency with which we must pursue it.